My husband secretly took hair from our daughter's brush to DNA test her because his parents said she didn't look like him. I'm writing this 6 months after my marriage ended, and I still can't believe this is my life now. This is the story of how my husband of 16 years secretly DNA tested our 14-year-old daughter, how she found out, and how that single act of distrust destroyed our entire family. It started with his parents planting seeds of doubt and ended with my daughter refusing to speak to her father and our family shattered beyond repair. I'm 42, and my ex-husband, David, is 44. We met in college, got married at 26, and had our daughter Maya when I was 28. For 14 years, we were a happy family, or at least I thought we were. Turns out, David had been harboring doubts about Maya's paternity for years, fed by his parents' constant comments about how she didn't look like him. Maya is beautiful. She has dark curly hair, olive skin, and hazel eyes. She looks exactly like my mother, her grandmother, who passed away when Maya was 6. My whole side of the family has these features. I have them. My brother has them. It's clearly genetic and clearly from my side. David, on the other hand, is pale, with straight blonde hair and blue eyes. His whole family looks like that. Scandinavian genetics, very light coloring, very distinct features. Maya got none of that, which apparently became a problem for David's parents, even though it had never seemed to bother David himself. David's parents, Richard and Patricia, had made comments over the years about Maya not looking like their side of the family. Little things like, "Isn't it interesting that she looks nothing like David?" Or, "She must have gotten everything from your side." Or, "I wonder if she'll develop any family features as she gets older." I'd always brushed these comments off as thoughtless but not malicious. I thought they were just observations about genetics, not accusations about infidelity. I was wrong. Those comments had been slowly poisoning David's mind for years, making him doubt something he should have never questioned. And instead of talking to me about these doubts like an adult, like my husband and partner, he decided to secretly DNA test our daughter. The way he did it makes me sick to think about. He took hair from Maya's brush one morning when she was at school, just went into her bathroom, pulled strands of hair with roots attached from her brush, put them in a plastic bag, and sent them off to a DNA testing company. He did this without telling me, without asking Maya's permission, without considering what it would mean if she found out. He violated our daughter's privacy and bodily autonomy because his parents had made him doubt me, and I hadn't even known there was doubt to address. The test came back showing what anyone with eyes could have told him. Maya is his biological daughter. She just happens to look like my side of the family. Shocking revelation, really. Almost like genetics are more complicated than coloring matching. David told me about the test after he got the results. He sat me down one evening after Maya had gone to bed and confessed what he'd done. He said his parents had been making comments for years about how Maya didn't look like him, that they'd started suggesting maybe I'd had an affair, that the doubts had been eating at him and he needed to know for sure. He said he'd gotten the results back, and of course Maya was his daughter, and he felt terrible for doubting, but he needed to know. He said it like I should be understanding, like this was a reasonable thing he'd done, like violating our daughter's privacy and doubting my fidelity was just a minor relationship bump we'd get over. I was stunned. I couldn't even form words at first. My husband of 16 years had thought I'd cheated on him and lied about our daughter's paternity for 14 years. He'd taken hair from our daughter's brush without her knowledge or consent to test her DNA. He'd done all of this based on comments from his parents, instead of trusting me or using basic logic about how genetics work. When I finally found my voice, I asked him how long he'd been doubting. He admitted it had been on and off for years, but had gotten worse recently. His parents had been more vocal about it. They'd shown him photos of himself at Maya's age and pointed out how different they looked. They'd made comments about how Maya's personality was nothing like anyone in their family. They'd essentially convinced him that I'd cheated and passed off another man's child as his. I asked him why he'd never talked to me about these doubts. He said he was afraid of what I'd say, afraid of starting a fight, afraid of being wrong. So instead, he just secretly DNA tested our child. Much better solution, clearly. I told him he needed to leave, that I couldn't even look at him right now, that he'd betrayed both me and Maya in the worst possible way. He tried to argue that he hadn't betrayed Maya because she didn't know. I told him that made it worse, not better, that he'd violated her privacy without her knowledge, that if she ever found out, she'd be devastated. He left that night and stayed with his parents, which felt grimly appropriate since they'd caused this whole mess. I spent the night crying and trying to process what my husband had done. The next few days were tense. David wanted to come home and move past this. I told him I needed time to think. He said there was nothing to think about. The test proved Maya was his daughter, so everything was fine. I tried to explain that everything was not fine, that he'd fundamentally violated my trust, that he'd believed I was capable of that kind of deception for 14 years, that he'd let his parents' opinions matter more than his faith in me. He didn't seem to understand why I was so upset. In his mind, he'd had doubts, he'd resolved them, and now we should move on. He couldn't grasp that the doubt itself was the problem, that the secret test was the problem, that 14 years of apparently fake trust was the problem. We were in this tense standoff, with David staying at his parents' house and me trying to figure out if our marriage was salvageable, when Maya found the DNA test results. David had printed out the results and left them in his office at home. He'd shoved them in a drawer, probably thinking they were hidden. But Maya had been looking for printer paper for a school project and found them. She came to me holding the papers, confused and scared. She asked me what a paternity test was. Why did Daddy have one with her name on it? What did it mean? My heart shattered. This was my worst fear realized. I'd been trying to protect her from this knowledge while figuring out what to do about my marriage, but now she knew, and I had to explain it to her. I sat her down and tried to explain as gently as possible that Daddy had taken some of her hair to do a DNA test, that he'd wanted to make sure she was his biological daughter, that the test showed she was, which we'd always known, but Daddy had needed proof. Maya's face went through so many emotions: confusion, hurt, anger, betrayal. She asked why Daddy would need to test if she was his daughter. I explained that Grandma and Grandpa had made comments about her not looking like Daddy, and those comments had made him doubt. She asked if I'd done something to make him doubt. I assured her I hadn't, that I'd never been unfaithful, that she was absolutely David's daughter and always had been, that this was about Daddy's insecurity and his parents' influence, not about anything real. Then Maya asked the question I'd been dreading. Did Daddy think I wasn't his because of how I look? Did he not want me to be his daughter? I tried to explain that it wasn't about not wanting her. It was about doubts planted by his parents. But Maya was 14 and smart, and she understood what had really happened. Her father had doubted her paternity enough to secretly test her DNA. That meant, on some level, he'd believed she might not be his. That meant he'd looked at her for 14 years and wondered if she was really his daughter. Maya started crying, deep, painful sobs that broke my heart. She kept saying, "Why would Daddy do that? And doesn't he love me? And how could he think that about me?" I held her and tried to comfort her, but there was no comfort to be found. Her father had betrayed her trust in the most fundamental way. She asked if Daddy knew that she'd found the results. I said no. She said good. She didn't want to talk to him. She didn't want him to know she knew. She just wanted him to stay away. I called David that night after Maya had cried herself to sleep. I told him she'd found the test results. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then he asked what she'd said. I told him she was devastated and didn't want to see him, that she felt betrayed and doubted and unloved. David immediately wanted to come over and talk to her. I said absolutely not. She'd asked for space, and I was going to respect that. He said I was keeping his daughter from him. I said no, his own actions had driven his daughter away, that he'd done this to himself. He showed up at the house the next morning anyway. Maya was getting ready for school and heard his voice downstairs. She locked herself in her bedroom and refused to come out. David stood outside her door, trying to talk to her, apologizing, saying he loved her, saying it was a mistake. Maya yelled through the door that if he really loved her, he wouldn't have doubted she was his daughter. That if he really trusted Mommy, he wouldn't have tested her. That she didn't want to talk to him and he needed to go away. It was horrible watching this unfold. David was crying, begging Maya to let him explain. Maya was crying, but holding firm that she didn't want to see him. I finally told David he needed to leave, that he was making things worse, that Maya needed space. He left, but the damage was done. Maya refused to talk about it for days. She went to school, came home, did her homework, and went to bed early. She was quiet and withdrawn. She stopped smuddling. She stopped laughing at things that used to make her giggle. She was grieving the father she'd thought she had, the one who'd loved her unconditionally, only to discover he'd had conditions all along. David kept trying to reach out. He'd text her, call her, send her messages through me. Maya ignored all of it. She said she had nothing to say to him, that he'd made his feelings clear by taking her hair and testing it without her permission. About a week after Maya found out, David's parents called me. Patricia wanted to know why Maya wasn't talking to David. I told her exactly why. That Maya had found the DNA test results and was devastated that her father had doubted her paternity. There was a pause, then Patricia said, "Well, can you really blame him? Maya doesn't look anything like our family. It was natural for David to have questions." I lost it. I told Patricia that no, it wasn't natural to doubt your child's paternity based on their appearance, that genetics are complex and children don't always look like one parent, that their constant comments had poisoned David's mind and led to him violating our daughter's trust, that they'd destroyed our family with their suspicions and insinuations. Patricia got defensive. She said they'd just been making observations, that they'd never told David to do a DNA test, that this was between David and me and they shouldn't be blamed for our marriage problems. I told her that her observations had been accusations, that she'd spent 14 years implying I'd cheated on her son, that she'd convinced him to doubt me instead of trusting his wife, that Maya had heard enough of her comments over the years to know exactly where David's doubts had come from. Richard got on the phone and said I was being unfair, that grandparents naturally notice when grandchildren don't resemble their side of the family, that they just wanted David to be sure, that the test had proven Maya was his daughter, so everything should be fine now. I told them that everything was not fine, that their granddaughter wouldn't speak to her father because he'd secretly DNA tested her, that their son's marriage was probably over because he trusted their insinuations more than his wife, that they'd gotten what they wanted, proof that Maya was David's biological child, but they'd lost their granddaughter in the process. Patricia started crying and said they'd never meant for any of this to happen. I said they'd spent 14 years planting seeds of doubt and were now upset about the harvest. I told them not to contact me or Maya again and hung up. That conversation somehow got back to David, probably because his parents called him immediately. He called me angry that I'd yelled at his parents and blamed them for his choices. I told him his parents had absolutely contributed to his choices by spending years suggesting Maya wasn't his. He said they were just concerned grandparents and I was scapegoating them. This led to another huge fight. I told David that if he couldn't see how toxic his parents had been, then we had bigger problems than the DNA test. He said I'd always had issues with his parents and was using this as an excuse to drive a wedge between him and them. I said the only wedge was the one he'd created by believing their implications of infidelity over trusting his wife. We decided we needed marriage counseling if there was any hope of saving things. David moved back home, but we were essentially separated while living in the same house. He slept in the guest room. We barely spoke. Maya still refused to talk to him or be alone with him. The first few therapy sessions were brutal. The therapist asked David to explain why he'd felt the need to DNA test Maya. He talked about his parents' comments, about Maya not looking like him, about doubts that had grown over time. The therapist asked why he'd never discussed these doubts with me. He said he'd been afraid. The therapist pointed out that 14 years of hidden doubt was incredibly damaging to a marriage, that trust is fundamental, and David had shown he didn't trust me. David tried to argue that he'd trusted me most of the time, it was just occasional doubts. The therapist said trust isn't occasional, it's constant. You either trust your partner or you don't. We talked about what it would take for me to trust David again. I honestly didn't know if I could. He'd shown me that when his parents raised doubts, he'd believe them over me, that he'd violate our daughter's privacy rather than have an honest conversation with his wife, that he'd let suspicions fester for years rather than address them directly. The therapist asked what David would do differently if he could go back. David said he'd talk to me about his doubts instead of secretly testing Maya. But then he added that he might still want a DNA test for peace of mind. I asked him how he could say that after everything. He said the doubts had been real and he'd needed resolution. That's when I realized our marriage was probably over. David still didn't understand that the doubts themselves were the betrayal, that needing resolution through a DNA test meant he'd fundamentally not trusted me, that even now, after everything, he was defending his choice to test Maya rather than fully acknowledging how wrong it had been. The therapist also suggested family therapy with Maya. We asked Maya if she'd be willing, and she said only if Daddy admitted what he did was wrong and why it was wrong. Not just that he was sorry, but that he understood why it was a betrayal. David sat down with Maya to have this conversation. I wasn't present, but Maya told me about it later. David apologized for doing the test without telling her, for doubting her paternity, for letting his parents' comments influence him. He said he loved her and had always loved her, and the test didn't change that. Maya asked him if he'd looked at her differently before the test, if he'd wondered whether she was really his. David hesitated, then admitted that sometimes he'd wondered, that when his parents made comments, he'd look at her and notice she didn't look like him, and the doubts would surface. Maya started crying and asked how he could have looked at her and doubted her, how he could have taken her hair without asking, how he could have violated her privacy like that. David said he'd been wrong and he was sorry, and he'd do anything to make it right. Maya said she didn't know if anything could make it right, that she'd spent 14 years thinking her daddy loved her unconditionally, and now she knew there had always been this doubt hanging over her, that every time Grandma and Grandpa had made comments about her not looking like the family, Daddy had been silently agreeing with them instead of defending her. David tried to say he had defended her, but Maya called him out on that. She said if he'd really defended her, he wouldn't have let the doubts grow. He would have shut down his parents' comments immediately. He would have told them to stop making observations about her appearance. He would have protected her from their implications instead of letting them poison his mind. She was right. David had never once told his parents to stop commenting on Maya's appearance. He'd never pushed back when they'd made pointed observations about her looking nothing like him. He'd let them plant doubt after doubt and had done nothing to defend his daughter or his wife from their insinuations. Maya told David she needed time before she could have a normal relationship with him again, that she couldn't just forgive and forget it, that every time she looked at him now, she'd think about him doubting whether she was his daughter. That was going to take time to get past, if she could get past it at all. David was devastated but had to accept it. He moved out again, this time into an apartment instead of his parents' house. I think even he recognized that staying with his parents after all this would be inappropriate. We continued marriage counseling, but it became increasingly clear that our marriage was over. I couldn't get past the betrayal. Every time I looked at David, I felt hurt and angry. I kept thinking about those 14 years where he'd apparently been doubting me, questioning Maya's paternity, believing I was capable of that kind of deception. David tried to minimize it, saying the doubts weren't constant, just occasional. But occasional doubts over 14 years were still doubts. They were still a lack of trust. They were still a fundamental problem with our relationship that I'd had no idea existed. I also couldn't forgive him for how he'd handled it, for taking Maya's hair secretly, for violating her privacy and bodily autonomy, for being more concerned with resolving his doubts than with how his daughter would feel if she found out, for thinking he could keep this secret forever and it would be fine as long as no one knew. The thing that really killed the marriage for me was David's continued relationship with his parents. He never fully held them accountable for their role in this disaster. He'd say they'd made some inappropriate comments, but ultimately the decision to test Maya had been his, which was true, but incomplete. His parents had spent 14 years planting seeds of doubt. They'd made countless comments about her appearance. They'd shown him side-by-side photos pointing out differences. They'd suggested I might have been unfaithful. They'd created an environment where David felt like testing Maya was necessary. And David never told them to stop. He never cut them off for what they'd done. He never demanded they apologize to Maya or to me. He just kept having a relationship with them, like nothing had happened, like they hadn't destroyed our family with their suspicions. I told David I couldn't stay married to someone who prioritized his parents' feelings over his wife and daughter's well-being. He accused me of making him choose between his parents and his marriage. I said he'd already made that choice when he'd believed their implications of infidelity over trusting me. We filed for divorce 8 months after Maya found the DNA test results. It was ugly and painful and sad. Ending a 16-year marriage over something that should have never happened in the first place felt surreal. The divorce proceedings brought up more painful truths. David's lawyer tried to argue that I'd kept Maya from him after she found the test results, that I'd been alienating her from her father. I had to explain to a judge that Maya had independently chosen not to see her father after discovering he'd secretly DNA tested her, that I'd never encouraged her distance or spoken badly about David to her. Maya actually had to speak to the judge herself. She was 14 by then and old enough for her opinion to matter in custody arrangements. She told the judge she didn't feel comfortable being alone with her father right now, that she felt betrayed by what he'd done, that she needed time to process before she could have a normal father-daughter relationship again. The judge was sympathetic, but also said that David was Maya's father, and she needed to have some relationship with him. We arranged supervised visitation to start, with the hope of working up to regular custody once Maya felt more comfortable. Those supervised visits were painful to watch. Maya would show up, sit quietly for the required time, answer David's questions with 1 or 2 words, and leave as soon as the time was up. She wasn't outright hostile, but she wasn't engaged either. She was just going through the motions because a judge had said she had to. David tried so hard during those visits. He'd bring her favorite foods, ask about school, try to talk about her interests. Maya would participate minimally and watch the clock. The moment the visit was over, she'd leave. The visitation supervisor told me privately that she'd never seen a case quite like this. Usually when teens are distant from a parent, it's because of abuse or abandonment or addiction. But David had been a good father before this. He'd been present and involved and loving. He'd destroyed his relationship with his daughter with one act of mistrust, and she couldn't get past it. David's parents tried to reach out to Maya a few times. She refused all contact. They sent her letters apologizing and saying they loved her. She threw them away without reading them. They sent gifts for her birthday. She donated them to charity. Patricia called me crying one day, saying she just wanted to see her granddaughter and didn't understand why Maya was punishing her. I told her that Maya understood perfectly that her grandparents' comments had led to her father testing her DNA, that she associated them with the betrayal, that they'd made her feel like she didn't belong in the family because she didn't look like them. Patricia insisted they'd never meant it that way, that they'd just been making observations. I told her that 14 years of observations about a child not looking like the family were accusations, whether she'd intended them that way or not. That Maya had heard those comments her entire life and now understood what they really meant. Richard got on the phone and said Maya needed to forgive them. That family forgives each other. That holding grudges was unhealthy. I told him that 14-year-olds get to decide who they want in their lives, and Maya had decided she didn't want grandparents who'd spent her childhood questioning whether she really belonged in the family. I told them not to contact me or Maya again and hung up. They tried a few more times, but I blocked their numbers. Eventually, they stopped trying. The divorce was finalized a year after Maya found the test results. David got visitation rights, but Maya was old enough that her preferences mattered. She agreed to see him once a week for a few hours. No overnight visits, no holidays, just a few hours on Saturday afternoons where they'd get lunch and maybe see a movie. It was a sad ending to what had been a happy family. Maya had lost the close relationship she'd had with her father. David had lost his marriage and his daughter's trust. I'd lost my husband and the life we'd built together. All because David's parents had planted doubts and David had secretly tested our daughter instead of trusting his wife. The aftermath has been hard on all of us. Maya is in therapy to process the betrayal and work through her feelings about her father. She's doing okay, but she's changed. She's more guarded now, less trusting. She's learned that even people who are supposed to love you unconditionally might have conditions you didn't know about. I'm also in therapy, working through my anger and hurt and trying to figure out who I am as a divorced single mother. Some days are better than others. Some days I'm fine and moving forward. Other days I'm furious all over again, thinking about those 14 years David spent doubting me. David is supposedly in therapy too, though I only know that through our custody coordinator. He's told Maya he's working on himself and hopes they can rebuild their relationship. Maya is non-committal about that possibility. The hardest part for me is watching Maya navigate this. She's at an age where she needs her father. She's dealing with all the normal teenage stuff, plus the trauma of discovering her father doubted her paternity. She puts on a brave face, but I know she's hurting. She's asked me a few times why I didn't cheat on Daddy if he was going to accuse me of it anyway. It's said as a dark joke, but it reflects her pain. She feels like I was punished for something I didn't do, that our family was destroyed based on false accusations, that Daddy threw away everything for doubts that were never valid. I tried to explain to her that Daddy's doubts weren't about facts or reality, they were about his own insecurity and his parents' influence. That some people need outside validation even when they have inside knowledge. That Daddy looked at her every day and knew she was his daughter, but still needed a DNA test to believe it. She's asked if she can change her last name to my maiden name. She doesn't want to share Daddy's name anymore when Daddy doubted she had the right to that name. I've told her she can make that decision when she's 18 if she still feels that way, but it hurts my heart that she's even thinking about it. 6 months post-divorce, I'm starting to build a new life. I've been on a few dates, though nothing serious. I'm focused on Maya and her healing, on making sure she knows she's loved unconditionally by me, by my family, by people who would never doubt her. My family has been incredibly supportive. My father said if he ever sees David or David's parents, he's not responsible for what he might say. My brother offered to go have a conversation with David about respecting women and children. I've declined these offers, but appreciated the sentiment. My mother, before she passed, used to say Maya looked just like her. She'd comment on the same curly hair, the same olive skin, the same hazel eyes. She'd been so proud that her granddaughter resembled her. If she'd lived to see this, to know that these family features had caused Maya to be DNA tested by her own father, she would have been heartbroken. I think about my mom a lot now, about how she'd held Maya as a baby and pointed out all the ways Maya looked like our side of the family, about how she'd never questioned Maya's paternity because she could see herself in Maya's face, about how obvious the genetic connection was to anyone who actually looked. David's parents couldn't see that connection because they were only looking for themselves in Maya's features. They weren't seeing her as a unique combination of both families. They were only noticing what she didn't have from their side and interpreting that as evidence of infidelity. The DNA test results are still in my possession. David left them here after the divorce. Sometimes I look at them and get angry all over again. They're scientific proof of something that should have never needed proving. They're evidence of betrayal and mistrust. They're the beginning of the end of my marriage. Maya has asked to see them a few times. I'm not sure if I should show her. On one hand, they're about her, and she has a right to know. On the other hand, seeing scientific confirmation that her father doubted her might make things worse. So far, I've put her off, saying we can discuss it when she's older. I wonder sometimes if things would have been different if David had just talked to me about his doubts. If he'd said his parents were making comments and it was bothering him, could we have worked through it? Could I have shown him photos of my family, pointed out the genetic connections, helped him see what should have been obvious? Maybe. Or maybe the doubts were too deep, and he would have wanted the test anyway. Maybe there was no version of this where David trusted me enough to not need scientific proof. Maybe our marriage was doomed the moment his parents started planting seeds of doubt and he let those seeds take root. I'll never know. All I know is that David chose to secretly test our daughter instead of trusting his wife. He chose to violate Maya's privacy instead of having an honest conversation. He chose to believe his parents' insinuations over 14 years of marriage and partnership. And those choices destroyed everything. People ask me sometimes if I think David and Maya will ever repair their relationship. I honestly don't know. Maya is deeply hurt, and that hurt has turned to anger. She feels betrayed by the person who was supposed to love her unconditionally. She's learned that even parental love has conditions and caveats. David wants to repair things, but he still doesn't fully grasp what he did wrong. He thinks the problem was keeping the test secret, not doing the test itself. He thinks if he'd just told us up front, it would have been fine. He doesn't understand that the doubt itself was the betrayal. Until David truly understands that, I don't think he and Maya can heal. She needs him to acknowledge that doubting her paternity was wrong, not just that doing it secretly was wrong. As for me and David, we're over. The divorce is final. We co-parent as much as Maya allows, but we're not friends. We're not even friendly. We're two people who used to love each other and now just feel the weight of betrayal and lost trust. Sometimes I wonder what David tells people about our divorce. Does he tell them he secretly DNA tested our daughter? Does he admit that's why Maya won't talk to him? Or does he frame it some other way? Make it sound like I overreacted, like it wasn't that big a deal? I'll never know, and it doesn't really matter. The people who matter know the truth. Maya knows. My family knows. That's enough. This whole experience has taught me things I wish I didn't know. that trust can be broken in an instant, that secrets have a way of coming out, that you can live with someone for 16 years and not really know what they're thinking, that in-laws can destroy marriages without ever meaning to. It's taught me that genetics are complicated and meaningless compared to love and trust, that looking like someone doesn't make you family, and not looking like someone doesn't mean you're not. Most importantly, it's taught me that some betrayals can't be undone. You can apologize, you can explain, you can show scientific proof that the doubts were unfounded, but you can't undoubt someone. You can't unviolate their trust. You can't unbreak their heart. David doubted Maya's paternity for 14 years and kept it secret. Then he secretly tested her DNA without her knowledge or consent. Then she found out. And that's a betrayal that changed everything, for all of us, forever. 6 months later, we're all still dealing with the fallout, and we will be for years to come. Because David took hair from our daughter's brush based on his parents' comments, and in doing so, he destroyed our family. That's my story. A marriage ended and a father-daughter relationship destroyed, all because of doubt that should have never existed, and a test that should have never happened. All because one man believed his parents' insinuations more than he trusted his wife. All because he thought he could violate his daughter's privacy and it wouldn't matter as long as she didn't find out. But she did find out, and it mattered more than any of us could have imagined. And now we're all living with the consequences of one terrible decision made in secret. Did this story get to you? Leave a like and subscribe. More true stories are coming soon.